I think we're now all ready to start. So I will call on Geraldine, who is our MC for this evening. And then I'll do that.
Oh, right. Yes. Look, I'll just quickly to let people know that the toilets are out the back if you need them. What we're going to do is basically hear from James, Father Alison. Then we'll have a little bit of a, we'll call Finn up, Finn Stannard up, who's got a very personal account of some of the discussions we're having tonight. And then we'll have a little bit of a powwow in typical Catalyst fashion. And then we'll throw it open and I'll make sure that there's lots of time for questions. So that's the general flavour of the evening. And of course we will be out dead on time as we have a tendency to do. So I'll hand over back to Denise.
Thanks, Geraldine. The Acknowledgement of Country was written by our next student of Aloysius, Jonathan Hill. So I will just read that through for us. Today we stand in footsteps millennia old. Let us begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today, the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation, who once gathered on these foreshores, which they call Kirribilli, meaning a good fishing place. We also pay our respects to all elders past and present, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land, since men and women awoke from the great dream. We honour the presence of these ancestors who reside in the imagination of this land and whose spirituality continues to enrich us. So I would ask you to join with me in this prayer, which is a very old prayer, traditionally used for councils and synods. We stand before you, Holy Spirit, as we gather together in your name, with you alone to guide us. Make yourself at home in our hearts. Teach us the way we must go and how we are to pursue it. We are weak and sinful. Do not let us promote disorder. Do not let ignorance lead us down the wrong path, nor partiality influence our actions. Let us find in you our unity, so we may journey together to eternal life, and not stray from the way of truth that is right. All this we ask of you, who are at work in every place and time, in the communion of the Father and the Son, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you, Denise. That's such a beautiful prayer. Well, welcome. I'm Geraldine Doogue. Welcome on behalf of Catalyst for Renewal. We're really delighted you could be here with us tonight, not in huge numbers, but all ready for a gorgeous discussion of some depth, which will be a real treat, I think. This, of course, is what Catalyst has committed itself to for almost the last 30 years. I don't know whether you heard the Richard Lenan from Boston College was here. It was a fabulous event, actually. I'm still thinking about it, on an in-between church, and an August discussion on the future of the Catholic Church with Bishop Danny Marr and John Warhurst, which I regrettably couldn't go to. Now, could I please also welcome special guests, Anne Walker and Sylvia McRitchie-Hook from Catholic Religious Australia, who brought James to Australia, and Father Ross Jones, SJ, who's the rector here at Aloysius, and Mark Tannock, its principal. Thank you very much indeed for making us welcome. We've done our mobiles, haven't we? Because we're going to record this, you see, so we really would prefer that mobiles didn't interfere. So, as I said, we'll hear James address us, then Finn Stannard will join us, and time for some decent Q&A, I hope. Now, so we're going to, I'm delighted to say, hear from Father James Alison, theologian, priest, author, known for bringing the work of the French thinker René Girard to a wider audience. He travels the world, really, as a bit of an evangelist, if he doesn't mind me using that term for his approach. He's a true example of the big challenge of our time, of bridging the gap between people who study things in depth, as he does, and those of us who just manage to keep up with life. but would like to be a little better informed. Well, he does that very well. In fact, looking at his various contributions, I personally think that you're a very good example of the Christ's incomparable invitation. You know, I have come to bring you life and bring it in abundance. I do actually think James very much exemplifies this, as we'll hear. And I think he does live out that hope and wants to share how he does it. He does insist on what he regards as truthfulness in matters gay, if I can put it like that, as just an ordinary part of basic Christianity, and he really works on his pastoral approach in this realm. He wasn't brought up Catholic, but he chose to study with the Dominicans in Oxford and at the Jesuit theology faculty in Brazil. He's now based in Madrid. Well, he's loosely based there because he certainly does travel a great deal. He's a prolific writer, and listen to these titles: Faith Beyond Resentment, On Being Liked, The Joy of Being Wrong, New Creations, Intimations of a Great Reversal, and the classic Knowing Jesus, which is, I think, nearly 30 years old now. And that was where Rowan Williams contributed his lovely analysis. James Alison's work, he wrote, is a model of how to deploy some very traditional Christian resources with a thoroughly contemporary intellectual toughness, so as to liberate us from the cliches of so much modern theological squabbling. So I invite James to address us now with his thoughts around what does radical inclusion really mean in a contemporary church. James.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm not quite sure which of the speakers I'm speaking to. Are we okay? Okay, great. Is all audible? Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And first, may I say how honoured and delighted I am to be here. Thank you very, very much indeed. As you so kindly mentioned, Geraldine, to Anne and to Sylvia for having made it possible for me to be here, to the Jesuits for having accepted me to come into this illustrious hall, and to you, Geraldine, for coming and bringing this evening. And I cannot tell you how honoured I am, Finn, to be sharing a stage with you in your native city, though not in the school in which you originally burst upon the world stage, as you will no doubt do later this evening. I was asked to speak about this issue of inclusion, particularly as we're beginning to become aware of it with relation to the process of synodality. And one of the things which I suspect you will all have noticed is that some people are criticizing this for being a talking shop. Have you heard that before? You're saying, yeah, it's all talk, talk. And one of the things I want to say is I am quite sure that's deliberate. Talkability has been one of the most difficult things surrounding any of the issues which we now describe as in need of inclusion over the last many, many years. So what I'd like to do is start by having a look at how actually talkability is bursting on our scene. You would have heard one of Pope Francis's often repeated phrases is that reality is bigger than ideas. Is that a one you've heard before? Well, that's all very well, but it's how reality makes itself known to us and shares itself amongst us that is actually in question. And that includes how we are able to make it something that can be talked about. Now, some of you, who like me share a certain age, will have been brought up in a Catholic world which was still wrestling with the end of how we used to think from the beginning of the early modern period. The period which is famously linked to Descartes, the beginning of the Enlightenment, rationalism. What these had in common was the notion that thinking starts here, and then there are things like emotions and feelings and doubts and passions, which can't really be relied upon for anything. They're dubious, and they need to be controlled. And so one is supposed to develop rational ideas to quash down the unruly feelings and doubts that might come upon us. And of course this fit very nicely into a certain picture of the Catholic Church, where you had the head of the body assumed to be these clerical males, particularly bishops and the Pope, who had clear and distinct ideas which they understood specially by divine inspiration, and they could pass their truths down to the rest of us, who are bearers of passionate, dubious bodies and much inclined to misbehave. It doesn't particularly matter if we misbehave, because we can always go to confession, but what we mustn't do is challenge the right ideas which the head has. Does that sound at all familiar to you? Yeah, okay. It's not too much of a parody, is it? And sometimes actually they're ways of expressing themselves. So, why did you not come and consult us about these things? We could have told you what the truth was. A genuine belief that their mental deliberations, which were often a priori deductions from philosophical principles, could tell us what to do. Now, that doesn't wash anymore for a whole variety of reasons. But I think the most important one is that we've become aware over the last 150 years, 200 years, that relationality is prior to rationality. It's a difficult sounding phrase, but let me just flesh it out. As relations with people influence us, so we begin to think differently. It's relations that lead to changes in thinking, not changes in thinking that impose new ways of relating to people. Why? Because actually our ways of relating to people work slowly, often at an unconscious level, changing our patterns of desire, changing the ways we know and communicate and congregate with each other, until certain things that we wouldn't have understood before become quite clear to us. That means that the old way of top-down communicating doesn't work, because we've learnt a lot of things sideways. One of the great challenges to that top-down way of understanding things actually was the birth of the novel. Interestingly, at the same time as the Western world was getting caught up in rationalism, in an excessively bizarre relation to certain mental objectivity, the novel was being invented. The notion of penitent autobiography, the way that relationships alter people, ran from the 17th through the 21st century. In other words, a completely different way of learning and knowing through storytelling has come upon us. And at the same time, particularly from the late 19th century onwards, the beginnings of psychology. Again, involving new forms of talking about things that couldn't really be talked about before. I think that this is something that is tremendously important when it comes to understanding why we are where we are with matters LGBT in the life of the Church. Indeed, why we are where we are in relation to the presence of women in the life of the Church. The ability to talk about things that couldn't be talked about before is breaking down a whole series of silos of knowledge that have turned out to be well past their sell-by date. So what I want to suggest is that when it comes to the process of developing inclusivity in the Catholic Church, actually it's the talkability of things that is making the real difference. And the talkability of things particularly if they're to do with matters gay, much more than to do with matters lesbian or matters trans. The talkability about things runs headlong into the structure of clerical formation in our church, for obvious reasons. Let's put a little bit of historical background on this. This is something I ask people to think. If you were a pious youth in the 1890s, let's say you come of age in 1903, let's say you were born in 1890, come of age in 1903, age 13, puberty, beginning to become aware that you may not quite be as others. And what do you see going on around you? You see, a certain amount of furtive life that might be going on, but also the ever-present threat of syphilis, of blackmail, of police raids, of terrible reputations. And if you're even marginally pious, you will say, oh, not me, Lord, not me, not me. Let me be safe from all that. And the safest space at that stage would have been the clerical world. The safest space in a very unsafe world would have been the clerical world. It seems bizarre to think of it that way now, but that was the case. At that time also there were just beginning to come to the surface novels, people beginning to write about their experience, both what we would now call gay men and lesbian women, the well of loneliness by, I've forgotten her first name, I think Radcliffe was the second name. Can anyone remember the author of the Well of Loneliness? I can't remember it, but it was one of the first lesbian novels. Again, the possibility of talking about these things begins to emerge. The shrinks are encouraging it, even if in a very, clinical way. But those who are not immediately drawn to being sorted out by psychiatrists or psychologists are starting to tell their stories. And these are being seen by some people as very avant-garde, very outré, very dangerous. The censors are at work. Nevertheless, the possibility of talking is emerging. Over the course of the early part of the 20th century, these things become more talkable as young men and young women return from mobilization in the Great War, and having met other people like themselves with whom they can start to talk, prefer to return to the great cities, and especially great ports, since navies often been sources of fun in these matters, it seems, enabling them to find other people like themselves and partners, whereas wherever they had come from before, they seemed to be the only gay in the village, the only lesbian in the village. Talkability grows. By the end of the Second World War, and the demobilization that followed that, and after the Nazis had stamped out the first attempts to treat what we would now call LGBT people scientifically, a new phase of learning emerges in which people are able effectively to say, yes, I am, so what? The most radically banal statement is the one, in fact, which is the sign that at last some kind of scientific objectivity has been reached through talkability. People have begun to be able to present themselves as they are without fear and make themselves available to scrutiny for people to see whether there might be something wrong with them or not. And behold, that generation of scientists in the 1950s are the first to be able to test and say, actually, we can find no pathology that appears to be intrinsic to these people. They seem to be the bearers of what I call a non-pathological minority variant in the human condition. Something much more akin to left-handedness than to, for instance, anorexia. Again, remarkable banality, the banality of the recognition that we gay and lesbian people are no more screwed up than anybody else. No less screwed up, but no more screwed up. And that our sexual orientation is not a particular source of screwed upness, even though there are certain minority consequences. Living in minority always produces certain disadvantages to that group, but they're not intrinsic to being that sort of person. They're intrinsic to being in a minority. As that talkability begins to emerge, people are able to get away with saying who they are, and the move for decriminalisation becomes ever stronger. You start to get a more accepting civil society. In all the Western countries, slowly but gradually, as the recognition that there is no pathology at work here. Now, during this same period, of course, something weird has happened in our church, which is that the people who had been in it because it was the safest space to be in a very unsafe world, precisely because it couldn't be talked about. The only discussion in the church was about acts, certain acts, acts that were in some cases described as not being able to be talked about, literally. In Spanish and Portuguese, one of the terms for what we on occasions call sodomy is el pecado nefando, the sin that cannot be spoken about. And one of the reasons why it wasn't spoken about was so that confessors wouldn't give instructions to sinners on how to sin. They were not supposed to give them advice on this sphere, lest they teach them new forms of lovemaking that they hadn't thought about before. The Kama Sutra of the medieval confessional. But quite literally, I mean, that's one of the reasons why whole chunks of it were not supposed to be put into the vernacular. Precisely because the threat of it being instructional rather than penitential was known to be a risk. So not being able to talk about these things was absolutely part of the don't ask, don't tell world, which has dominated the clerical structure of our church for centuries. But with the difference that what had been unsafe outside was becoming safe, and that means that what had been a fairly bland form of hypocrisy, if you like, quite a mild don't ask, don't tell, given that the society at large shared in the don't ask, don't tell, was becoming an ever more restrictive don't ask, don't tell. Rather than merely, as a general counsel, we don't want to talk about these things. It was, you shall not talk about these things, lest anybody know who you are, and if you are, you're out. In other words, whereas talkability had been imprudent before, now it's forbidden. And you start getting a much stronger line against, as the clerical structure realizes that something that holds together its whole formation, the don't ask, don't tell world of the clergy, is under threat. Now, in the years since the Second Vatican Council, obviously, what have we seen? We've seen a significant number of very senior clerics who have very obviously been, one can only say, poisonous gay men. People with an urgent need to clean out the Augean stables anywhere except within. This was particularly strong under John Paul, who surrounded himself with a coterie of such people. Why? Because they sang from the right hymn sheet, they sang from the John Paul hymn sheet, and so he wasn't concerned about other things. But that world has broken down. The world in which people imagine that somebody who is violently anti-gay in public is anything other than a closeted gay man. One of the things which we know, anybody who has any experience on the inside of the life of the church in the clerical world, is that those who are the most violent persecutors are inevitably gay. It is not straight people who persecute gay people within the church. On the contrary, straight people within the church, and in the case of the upper church, are few and far between, but are quite relaxed about dealing with these matters. Francis knows this. He's actually said so publicly. In a beautiful little interview he gave in Spanish to Disney Plus, one of the non-binary youth who's questioning him says, "What do we do when they throw us out? They don't allow us, gay and lesbian people, to be in the church." And he says, "Son infiltrados." They're infiltrators who use the gospel to hide their own passions. I almost fell out of my chair and spilled coffee all over myself when I read it, because I've been saying that for 30 years, but the one person I did not expect to hear it said was the Pope. But it's been his experience as well. He's aware that many of the people who attacked him when he was Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires were of this sort. And he's aware that the only way beyond a world in which we're dominated by fear and the inability to talk is to create the possibility of discussion. Which is why he's so keen that we begin to take advantage of what he's opened up for us, of actually talking about who we are, sharing our stories, making it much less a matter of shame and fear that these stories be shared, so that people whose lives have been a terrified flight from who they are can begin to relax into the Catholic loam, to use a word, a rather glorious, fertile form of land that can produce much, much harvest. So when it comes to talkability, I think that it's absolutely one of the key things. For the first time in history, within the last generation, the last couple of generations, we have people who are able to speak who we are in the first person. That was not possible before. We were a they who was described as people who were liable to commit particularly intrinsically evil acts, and then more recently, because we were bearers of an objective disorder. That was a desperate attempt to try and close the circle to define us as defective straight people. And why hasn't it worked? It hasn't worked because people have started to be able to say, well, this is my story, this is what I discovered about myself. I don't seem to think I'm a defective straight person. Am I? And other people to say, no, it doesn't seem you are really. Your love seems remarkably like how straight people love each other, except that it's for someone of the same sex. The official definition, of course, is derived from the marital act. For the last several hundred years, or thousands of years, we have been defined as failed straight people because our sexual acts do not produce babies. But actually asking us to discover who we are from a negative deduction from the marital act ceased to be possible the moment it became clear that being gay or lesbian is not a defect of anything. It's simply something that is a non-pathological minority variant. But it's one that can be talked about. Biographies can be shared, and not only great authors, Patrick White, Bruce Chatwin, other great Australian authors have shared in this. All our countries have our literary references who enabled us to begin to find our voice, but just meeting people. Relationality precedes rationality. That, it seems to me, is what Pope Francis is urging us to get on with in the build-up to the Synod. And I'm quite sure that it's why he's chosen a significant number of people who are able to speak, if not themselves in the first person, directly of their experience with people who are able to speak in the first person. I mustn't expect too much at once. It would be too bizarre to have many of self-outings in the synod. Seems unlikely. But the fact that people can recognize, wait a second, we know such people, the way you are talking about them, not only does it not bear scrutiny, just in terms of what we know about such people, but also your insistence on talking about them is actually driving all young people from the church. And not because all young people are gay, but because all young people are noble enough not to want to take part in something from which their gay and lesbian brothers and sisters are excluded, or in which they are treated badly. Making this talkability available seems to me what we're talking about in this process of synodality. So I'd like to leave you that as the beginnings of our discussion. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Well, I have to say that that fits very neatly into Catalyst for Renewal's whole sort of reason for being, which is conversation, and you've dubbed it differently, but it's very front and centre. Now I'm going to invite Finn to come up and join us. Finn graduated from Riverview, St Ignatius Riverview in 2018. He's now in the final year of a communications degree in media arts and production. And I do hope there are lots of jobs available for you, Finn, when you finish. I'm not entirely sure. Actually, Finn wanted to be a priest, I'm told, for about 9 months in year 6. But he continues to be involved in the wider Riverview community, and he particularly helps lead the annual Kairos retreats, which are very big in Riverview, I know, for year 11 and 12 students. And I'll let him explain what happened in 2018, which sort of was I think a major turning point for you, certainly in terms of talkability. But maybe you could just explain. You're mic'd up. He's mic'd.
Yes.
Oh, you're mic'd. Oh, thank heavens.
No, in 2018, so the year that I graduated, before I graduated, Riverview does this incredible assembly, essentially each year, where a senior student. It's called Friends Listen, and a senior student steps forward and is given the opportunity to let down their walls and be incredibly vulnerable with the entire cohort. Started with Xavier Eels, was the first ever Friends Listen assembly, and he spoke about his experiences with depression and anxiety throughout high school and how it affected him and his relationships with people. And then eventually, after a series of events involving bullying and not very great things, but things that tend to be quite normal in high school, unfortunately, I was given the opportunity to tell my story in 2018. And that was my story as a gay man growing up and attending Riverview, and my experiences, and it was very well received, which was incredible, and the school supported me throughout, and still does to this day. I still see the principal, Dr. Paul Hine. I saw him at work the other day, and he was telling me how he still finds ways to work me into conversation somehow. And I think this year as well, the Friends Listen Assembly, another boy spoke about his experiences coming out to his family. So it was an incredible opportunity that the school facilitated, and I was incredibly lucky to be able to make use of that opportunity, I think.
And can I ask you, how much did you think about saying that? Like, what prompted you? Was there a moment that you decided you would do that?
Seeing Xavier Eels do it and talking about his experiences. I struggled with depression throughout high school, just like many young people do nowadays. And seeing him be able to speak about his experiences and then the anxiety of it, but seeing the change that came from it, seeing how him being a leader and talking about these things made it something that we could talk about in school, and boys started to get help and speak out, and just the comfort level and the fear of taboo, I guess, just diminished. Not entirely, it's not magic, but it became something that could be discussed. And I was really struggling a lot throughout those years, but when I saw Xavier do it, I realised that if someone else wouldn't do it, then I really wanted to do that.
And you'd been, as I think you were telling people I know, you'd been the you'd been the older brother, the heterosexual older brother sort of thing. It was a safe position but it was troubling you. You really weren't safe there by the sound of it.
No, exactly. I wasn't being myself, and I don't think I think if you're lying to people, you're hurting yourself just as much as you're hurting others. If you can't be yourself around others, then they can't love you for who you are. And it was important to me that I be able to be myself because, you know, it's a big process, learning to love yourself and knowing who you are. And it was just very important to me that I'd be able to do that for my family and for my friends.
And how did your family react?
My parents were incredibly supportive. My brothers are equally incredibly supportive. My youngest brother just came out as gay this year as well. Right. And yeah, I've been incredibly fortunate. My family's been incredibly supportive, and while I've been very lucky, I've also been very aware that not all are just as lucky as me.
And would you say, honestly, that did you feel, were there any people who were just wary, not opposed, but wary, or not?
I mean, there are definitely some. Everyone's been taught different things and told different things about homosexuality. People have their own experiences, and while I've had a range of responses, a range of experiences. After the speech, I had nothing but support and love. I had the first 15 rugby team offering to come up and support me if I ever needed any help. So I was incredibly, I was incredibly lucky after the speech. Yeah.
And look, did your faith play any role in this? Did it provide you with consolation, or did it not?
My faith throughout my life has been a bit of a wave, and I think that's come a lot with understanding myself, my needs, and in so recognizing what faith is. You mentioned Kairos earlier before, and one of the aspects, one of the opportunities that I had on that retreat is being able to teach boys about spirituality. And I, as a young person and a queer person, was given an incredibly rare opportunity to discuss that, and I applied it in that I see a lot of God in the actions of others, the love of others, and that's kind of where my faith comes from. It's in faith in others and the love of others, and that's really what got me onto that stage when I gave that speech, was the belief of love.
The community.
Exactly.
And what about words like objectively disordered and those, the tough words now? Do they affect you or not?
Depends on where I am, who I'm with. I am very confident in my sexuality. I'm very confident in myself. But I know that if I'd been told these things when I was younger, they would have left me distraught. They would have left me terrified. And they would have left me probably from places that I probably wouldn't be able to come back from. Really?
And so you're not conscious of even having heard a lot of this by the sound of it? You were free of that?
I definitely wasn't free. The main reason I was able to give this speech was a quite severe bullying incident happened while I was at school. I was locked in a toilet stall and had my life threatened.
A group of boys or one boy?
Group of boys. And ironically, one of the counsellors at this school found out through my partner at the time, and then notified my school, and that was kind of how I started getting support from bullies, and it's kind of how the school became aware of my struggle with sexuality. And I mean, in the end, it did lead to me being able to do the speech. So I've had a range of experience, and I've had friends who had a range of experiences. That wasn't the first time that my life had been threatened.
Really?
Yes, unfortunately.
People actually threatening your life?
I've had a knife pulled on me. while I was out with a friend one night. That was on campus as well. So these things do happen. It's not a thing that doesn't happen anymore, unfortunately. People come from very varying backgrounds, and what they're taught is incredibly unfortunate a lot of the time. But I have to say that since the speech, I became wrapped in a community of support. So while I was by myself and I was, for lack of a better term, in the closet to my friends and my family, I was incredibly vulnerable. But it was once I was able to speak openly and have the support of others that I feel like that actually diminished.
Yeah, and of course that you vault forward when that happens. Yes, exactly. Look, I really wanted to take up your idea, James, of talkability, as you said, that you can, and because you had this lovely word, we are what we are who we are, relationally. So obviously this goes beyond this particular realm. That's, by the sound of it, that's a very basic view that you hold.
And I think it's a very basic view for most Catholic theology. Joseph Ratzinger holds the same. Pope Francis holds the same. The notion that ourselves are received through others. I mean, it is linked to the thought of my French thinker, René Girard, whom you quoted. But it's not, at this stage, it's not that odd a perception. The notion that we aren't really as individuals as we like to think we are.
Well, our Father Michael Whelan, who constantly says this to us, has been sort of a complete mantra of his over many, many years. I'm wondering how you feel Francis will carry this forward. I mean, I just looked up quite a lot of information about it. You know, he has officially stated that he wants a repeal of laws that discriminate against LGBTQ, but then he went on to make those statements that while it wasn't a crime, it was a sin. And I know that you've got all sorts of thoughts. And then he went on to say that lack of charity with a neighbour is a sin too. Now, this was conducted in Spanish, which of course you understand. Now, what's the context for this in your view?
Well, the context for that particular discussion was an interview with an Argentinian journalist, I think for AP, Allied Press.
I'm not sure who.
But it was.
AP, Associated Press.
Associated Press, right. And yeah, one of the problems of it was that they then carried the headline, Pope says homosexuality isn't a crime, but it is a sin. That's not what he said. It was exactly what he said if you transcribed it, but it just shows how important it is to actually watch how the conversation went. Because he said, no es un pecado, and then he put himself to one side as though he was introducing the voice of someone else, saying, pero es un pecado. So someone else is intervening, saying, but it's a sin. And he's saying, yeah, just like gossiping with your neighbours is a sin. But you see, the moment you realise that actually he's put a phrase into the mouth of another person, and then he answers it, you can see, no, this is, that's the difficulty. If you just transcribe exactly what someone says, you don't actually get the meaning of an exchange where someone has literally shifted their physical face and shifted their tone of voice. So it was, I mean, I was exceedingly glad that he...
He rang you, didn't he?
Sorry?
He rang you after that, didn't he?
Oh, no, it was sometime earlier that he rang.
Well, tell us about that, please, because that is also very pertinent.
Well, yeah, that was rather nice. That was he rang me in 2017. In 2015, the Cardinal of San Paolo, tried to have me removed from the priesthood without actually adducing any reasons. So it meant setting up one of these circular Roman processes whereby they decide they want to remove you, but they don't make any charges available to you, and they say you can't have any defence. So that doesn't, in legal terms, that's a bit of a series of red flags there. I mean, the canonists, it's a particular sort of process that the canonists hate, because they say if an accusation is not made and if defence is not allowed, it's not a properly legal process. But anyhow, it's a way of them trying to get rid of people who are inconvenient to them, even if that person hasn't done anything that they can put their finger on, you know, because there are There are charges that can be made, child abuse or falsifying sacraments or robbing the collection plate. There are N charges that you can imagine being made against someone, but they somehow never seem to get around to dealing with those. It's only the people they want to get rid of for excuses they haven't got. So anyhow, this process went ahead, and eventually I got a document in Latin saying, basically you are forbidden from doing anything. And it was in the name of the Holy Father, of course. I was forcibly laicized and not allowed to preach or any of these things. But anyhow, so I was a little bit upset about this, even though someone told me that if they send it to you in Latin, they don't really mind whether you obey it or not. If they send it to you in Latin, it's because they want to cover their posteriors. So say, we've done it, we did do it. If they really want you to obey it, they send it to you in a language you can understand. But anyhow, so that was their little game. But anyhow, so I showed it to my former novice master, who was a bishop in Mexico, and he said, "Oh, James, pay no attention. I mean, these guys, they got a neuron, mental brain working between them. They would have come up with some different way of dealing with this." But he said, "But don't bother to try and write to the Pope about this, because it will never get through to him because filters and things like that. But I will seek a private audience with him and ask him to sort it out." So he did. It took a bit of time. He had a private audience, and he had great credibility with Francis because they had both been, as it were, in the embattled minority during the John Paul years of rowing back against more progressive Catholicism in South America. So he knew that Raoul came from an honest place and a good heart. So after he'd had his interview with the Pope, his private audience, he rang me the next day and said, "Well, I gave him your letter, and he didn't seem to be at all upset that I wanted to talk about this. So something will happen. Something good will happen." And then about 2 months later, well, almost exactly 2 months later, the phone rang and hidden number. "Soy el Papa Francisco." This is Pope Francis speaking. So I say, "Really?" In Spanish, "En serio?" And he said, "No, just kidding, son. No, en broma, hijo." So my guess is that lots of people, when he calls them up in Spanish, must say, "En serio?" And so he just says, "No, just en broma," which is just kidding, son. But anyhow, it was he, and he had my letter in front of him, and he went through it, talking about friends that we had in common, and giving suitable descriptions of the mental abilities of the Cardinal of São Paulo. And then he said, "Now, James, I want you to walk with complete interior freedom, following the Spirit of Jesus. And I give you the power of the keys. Do you understand? I give you the power of the keys." So I said, yes, I understood, even though I didn't really, but I did kind of think that if the successor to Peter talks to you about keys, that it's probably important. So later I found out from a canonist, canon lawyer, that it means that he was obviously treating my priesthood as real rather than having been got rid of. So he was paid no attention to the Latin letter, and he was giving me what they call universal jurisdiction to preach and to confess, meaning that I don't have to ask dear Anthony to preach for permission to hear.
I see. You don't have to seek permission.
I have it, because the assumption is that no bishop would give it to me.
Well, that is an amazing story. I didn't quite understand that. So do we assume then that you think that Francis wants to change?
Oh, I'm quite sure that he realizes that dishonesty around this matter is one of the bulwarks of clericalism that he describes as a bad thing. The inability to be truthful and honest about this area.
Right.
From his point of view, it's just one of many things he knows needs to be sorted out. But yes, obviously there's a limit on what he can do. He can, if he were to use what I would consider the bad old view of reason that I suggested to you before, in other words, I sit at the top and I change the definition and you all obey, it wouldn't work. It would fall straight into the hands of people who would want to become schismatic and use it as a fight forever. But if what he can do is create circumstances where it's become a matter of common sense as of course it increasingly is amongst laity, that of course the old definitions don't work. Of course gay and lesbian people are not defective straight people. Therefore, of course, their behaviour, their marital life must be treated in quite a different way from what has been treated before. Then you can change the definition. Hence my understanding of why he understands that relationality comes prior to rationality.
But he hasn't, he forbade, didn't he, blessing. He pledged his support for civil same-sex unions, but he didn't allow blessings by the Vatican of same-sex unions. So, you know, I can't quite work out where he is, I have to admit.
Well, remember that not everything that comes out from the Vatican comes out from him, even if nominally it's passed by his nostrils. So there was a particularly nasty little document from the then CDF forbidding blessings, which clearly it made use of some phrase that indicated it had been in close proximity to the Holy Father without him necessarily.
Right.
But it turned out that it was a minority of people in that dicastery who'd rushed it out themselves as part of their battle with the German Synod. So he was exceedingly annoyed with that, and it was thereafter that he wrote publicly a letter to Jim Martin, the American Jesuit, Father James Martin, American Jesuit, making clear that we are loved as we are. So he was very, very annoyed by that. That was quite clear. Now, you're right. The trouble is that the Vatican communications are constantly engaged in mutual forms of blackmail amongst themselves. At the same time as his signature was on that document, well, not his approval was assumed for that document. At the same time, the Belgian bishops produced their blessings for same-sex couples and said, we'd like to go ahead with this. And this was just a few weeks after that document came out. Right. Belgian bishops the Flemish-speaking Belgian bishops presented to him the blessings which they wanted to introduce. And he said to them, are you sure you want to do this? And they said, yes. And he said, are you unanimous? And they said, yes. And so he said, well, go ahead. In other words, where it can be done without ruckus.
Right. What about Africa?
Well, there you have a completely different...
Well, what I mean is, I don't want to just be, blithe about it, but he has got to try to straddle a range of different views. And see, that talkability, that's just not happening in Africa yet, is it? Or is it?
Oh, it is, of course. Under the surface, the people are very, very aware of how to talk about certain things when certain people are present and other things when other people are present. That's what happens with any, if you like, well, yes, any institution and any oppressed group, is that they learn how to speak to whichever master is available. Now, you don't need to be a genius to realise that Africa is not a universally heterosexual continent. I've given talks there. In fact, one of the funniest talks I've given on this was actually at a seminary in South Africa, which contained seminarians from all over the whole African continent. And after I gave my spiel, a young man stood up, very powerful looking, and said, well, thank you so much for telling us about this. We understand that this is a problem for white people, but it is important that we learn about this as well. Right. Meanwhile, there were rows and rows and rows of black African seminarians in the streets behind him. They were falling off their seats with laughter because of the... And this is a person who represents a particular political organisation which claims that homosexuality is a white disease and basically Africans are natural and don't have this. And of course, literally the rest of the hall was full of Africans from different countries in Africa. And they were falling off their seats with hysterics at the nonsense this guy was. In other words, let's say the heterosexual proportion of African seminarians does not seem significantly higher.
Yes, but they're certainly not discussing. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the whole enlarge the space of your tent, which is the great sort of, the Isaiah, it's wonderful phrase from the Continental Synod document. I mean, that's invitational language, isn't it? I presume.
It's invitational language, but remember, that his point about decriminalisation, about which he was in no doubt at all, and there was no ifs and buts about that,
true.
he simply said, this is not something that it is proper to criminalise, it should be decriminalised. Well, the vast bulk of the countries that still criminalise homosexual behaviour are African. And by God, they were furious with him saying that. Why? Because it's a fantastically useful political bargaining chip, using that issue to get money or not to get money, and it's a useful scapegoat for a whole lot of other problems. We may not be doing anything useful, but we are killing the queers. In other words, suddenly for the Pope to say, no, it is wrong to criminalise, actually puts the Catholic bishops in those countries on the spot. And they have not been at all quick to uptake. The same people who are very keen on obedience and so forth under other circumstances, they have not been quick at all. They say, effectively, they said that the Pope has told us that we must accept homosexual marriage. Just to show how easily the things get conflated. If you say it must be decriminalised, what you're saying is that there must be homosexual marriage. So, as it were, the discussion is going to go and go.
Well, and before I suggest we all have a little bit of a powwow and then we come back, I wonder where you think we are then. Christopher Lamb wrote this, that France's comments once again show the slow yet steady shift taking place inside the church on LGBTQ Catholics, something kick-started to go 10 years ago with his Who Am I to Judge? Yeah. Now, is that how you describe it?
Yes. I think that what he's principally done is given little nudges that have actually altered the whole framework of the discussion. But what they have done above all is made something that was not talkable about. And I don't say that, as it were, vaguely. John Paul forbade people to talk about certain subjects. This was one of them. It meant that for a good period of time, bishops, clergy, academics in Catholic faculties were not able to talk about this subject without running risks of severe punishment. The result was that they made themselves dumb. And dumb, I mean stupid, with relation to the changes in society. They were not able to actually engage in the conversations that people were having. So they're locked into a bubble, which is like a 40 or 50 year time trap with relation to conversations which have shifted all of us over the last 50 years, which now make it possible for Finn and another generation of people to start to speak up openly at much younger ages than were possible before, and with also always the risks of violence, as he said, to get away with it, thank heavens.
Yes.
And to flourish. Now that's a huge change, and because they locked themselves out of that, he knows that you have to increase the ability of people to actually talk where people are. If your whole world is, we mustn't talk about this because this is a glass house where we can't throw stones, and now we've got everyone attacking us because of abuse. So basically we are in shut-down defensive crouch. He's saying, no, you've actually got to learn to talk about these. And he's making it possible for it to happen. And at the same time, I think that he's doing the equivalent of what FDR said, Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, in the United States when progressive Democrats wanted him to take much stronger action at the beginning of the Depression. What he said to them was, make me. In other words, he wanted to, but in order to be able to do it,
You had to collaborate.
he needed to be put in a position whereby he couldn't do otherwise.
Yeah, yes.
And I think that's the position.
Fascinating.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Now, I'm going to suggest that we all have a little 5-minute chit-chat, which we do. It's a very much a hallmark of our discussion. And then I'll invite broad Q&A when you come back. So talk amongst yourselves for about 5 minutes. Okay, we had our little powwow. We have two up here. Now, do we have mics? Or yes. Right, Julie's going to roast around with a mic. So just before we throw it open, I'm just going to ask Finn how you've been responding to what you've heard James saying. Finn?
Yeah, I think it's just been incredibly interesting hearing what James has been saying. All of it, I admit since graduating and since attending university, I haven't been closely following Pope Francis, but
Haven't you?
Oh, unfortunately not. There's so much TV to watch nowadays. But I've always been incredibly aware. I've always been sent articles whenever he does start talking about LGBTQI plus issues, and I think you're so right, James, in bringing context into the quotes. It's so easy to misquote someone. I'm doing a communications degree. It's so easy to misquote someone to make them sound like what you want them to sound like, and I think I entirely agree again with those small nudges in the right direction and opening up the space for community. That does seem to be what's happening, and I think the right steps are being made. So I just hope that they keep following in the right direction. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now, who'd like to kick off with a question? Just raise your hands and Julie will come to you. I mean, I can rabbit on, but I'd much prefer you to pose a question. Yes, over here, please. We were similarly lost, weren't we, together? We couldn't find the Great Hall.
We were found in the end.
Yes.
Thank you for these very interesting talks. I'm not a Catholic, but I find so much inspiration from Catholic spiritual traditions, spiritual direction, retreats, and so on. I'm wondering, it's hard to imagine the Catholic Church changing anytime soon when it comes to total affirmation of the diverse range of human sexuality and being. But can you imagine that future? And can you sketch what that future could look like? It's very hard to imagine. So just even talking about imagining, I think, could be helpful.
Do you want to start?
No, by all means. Yeah, it's a big question.
Okay, well, I suspect that it's coming sooner than we might think, because it's already started. One of the presumptions that we have had is that there must be some source of divine revelation from which the Church has been talking about these issues. And it turns out that if we look closely, the two supposed sources of insight into matters, at least L and G. For B, there's been no source of insight, and for T, likewise, have been, on the one hand, a negative deduction from the marital act. That tradition started in the 2nd century, which saw that as the only good form of sex, and everything else as some sort of defect from it. Therefore, of course, everyone else gets defined out of existence, basically. That on the one hand. And then, in the case of the Catholic Church, not in first place, but in second place, as sort of off-stage loud noises, the various biblical texts, which have become so much more important in Protestant arguments against gay people, because the Bible seems to have, because they're in the Bible. And it's interesting that, yes, they're good preacher fodder, but they've not actually been at the basis of the teaching. And nowadays, Catholic authority, the Biblical Commission, is perfectly happy to recognise that actually those texts cannot appropriately be applied to matters LGBT. So, curiously, on that front, there isn't a real problem. Now, the moment you recognise that neither of those sources are actually from divine revelation, they're from church tradition, they're traditions of venerable antiquity, but they don't seem to be compatible with how we understand what Christ is doing in our midst. Then the question arises of, well, in that case, given that we've got no source to talk to us about these people, what on earth are we going to say? We've got no official teaching about it, because what we thought was our official teaching turns out to have been based on less than reliable sources, given the matter at hand. And the answer is that it's only going to be coming from the people concerned themselves, as we work out amongst ourselves what is appropriate as forms of graced humanization for us. And that can only be worked out in the first person. First person singular and first person plural. So I would say that we're embarking on a stage now where, precisely as part of the discussability of things, people are starting to be able to talk about who they are. We're learning to assess whether they're being truthful or not. This applies to realities L, G, B, and T. And as we do that, we're beginning to find what seem to be forms of life that are genuinely life-giving for them and for others. And that's going to be the way forward. But it's going to have to start from the recognition that given that we have no jurisprudence in this area, because our previous sources have turned out not actually to be accurately describing the people concerned, we're going to have to take a little bit of time before we work out what the appropriate forms of flourishing are. But the Catholic discussion will be about the appropriate forms of flourishing, because that is the notion that you get to with the notion that grace perfects nature. So once you discover that something is part of creation, once you discover that a non-pathological minority variant, far from being a defect in creation, is actually part of creation, then the presupposition is, well, it's there to give a certain sort of glory to God. And the giving of glory to God is done by the human flourishing that is going to be enacted by people. The same with matters B and T. So we're going to be having to work that out. Now, I don't think there's a shortcut to that. There will be people, if you like, of a more legislative bent who will try to say, okay, now we're accepting gay and lesbian people, but now the war is against trans people because they are defying the very basis of creation, or something like that. They'll come up with some ideological reason why this issue can't be. And it will be nonsense. And patiently, people will have to work through what is true and what flourishing looks like. Because that's the fruit. By the fruit you shall know them.
It's a bit odd, isn't it, in some ways, though, that there was no reference from Christ to this wonderful variant that you... It is weird that it's this, the silence about it, isn't there?
I don't know. The reality, the way in which the ancient world saw this reality was so entirely different from what we can imagine, usually in terms of social inequality, with relation to very violent forms of possessiveness and slaves, amongst more aristocratic groups with very carefully defined roles. But I'm honestly not sure why he would have said anything. And to be honest, I don't think the Hebrew scriptures in general say anything about this. The story of Sodom clearly doesn't say anything about this, once you actually read what the text says. I suspect that the reading of the book of Leviticus, the two texts in Leviticus, I mean, there are now so many different theories as to what those words mean. But if it wanted to say, thou shalt not lie with a man, there's a perfectly easy, clear way, because it's referring to males, it's addressed to Hebrew males. If it wanted to say, thou shalt not lie with a man, there's a perfectly good, clear, easy way to say that in classical Hebrew. It doesn't. It says something subtly different. And what the subtle difference consists in is what the whole game is. I suspect that it is saying, you shall not lie with a male according to all the previous lyings with females that have just been described in the list above. Because all the previous verses are a long list of females within either direct relationship or kinship or affinity, I think is the term we use, isn't it?
It's about kinship structures.
It's about kinship structures. Thou shalt not, originally it's about thou shalt not lie with thy father's wife. Thou shalt not lie with thy father's concubine. Thou shalt not lie with thy uncle's wife. Thou shalt not lie with thy uncle's concubine. And then a whole list of females who are within forbidden limits. And in fact, it's the origin of our tables of
Aboriginal people. This is huge in Aboriginal law.
And indeed, it was in ancient Middle Eastern law. In fact, in the law of Hammurabi, it says quite specifically, you shall not lie with your daughter or with your son. It's perfectly clear. So I suspect that the most appropriate reading for those verses is "Thou shalt not lie with any of the males within the same degree of kinship and affinity as the females, as the above females." I think that it's inclusive in that sense. In other words, it's precisely to do with trying to prevent inter-family violence, which is what those...
Yes, please. Sorry, I couldn't see. Go ahead.
James, do you see any possibility of the development of the spirituality of sexuality?
I think I'm the wrong person to ask about that being... I'm honestly not sure what's meant by spirituality or sexuality. Sexual bodies and spiritual bodies. No, I don't know. You have me floored there. I've got no... I would hope that...
What do you mean? What do you mean?
I think it must be the case. It must be... sexuality must be a path to God.
Oh, yes. There's no question.
That's what I mean by it, but this is sort of taboo or not mentioned or brushed aside, or if you have to do it, but more as grudgingly. Can not we have something much more beautiful than that, and something that is actually a path to God?
Yes, and I think that often poets do that for us in ways that touch on things that most of us don't like talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Very clearly.
Exactly, also.
But,
and the idea that the celibate state is superior spiritually.
Yes, I don't think that anybody believes that.
That's a nonsense.
I think
and this, I think, is one of the facts that is holding it back, is that if you're not celibate, then you're not quite...
Yes, no, I agree. I think
that
our church's structure has inoculated us against being able to take that seriously.
That's what I mean. And do you think this will change with time? Something will develop, someone will start to talk about this as a spiritual state.
Well, do they with straight people?
I'm sorry?
Do they with straight people?
Not really. Not that I'm
Well,
aware.
only after marriage. I mean, that's the other thing. We're ignoring the fact that there is a trick here, isn't there, for the church, is to... And I don't quite know how Francis gets around this, despite all your... your accounts of the clever way in which he invites people to be relaxed. But is this going to be yielding to the notion of sex between people who are not married? That's going to be a challenge, isn't it?
Or why not marry them? I mean, I do. I've participated as a priest in several same-sex weddings. And I'm certainly not unique in that. It happens much more than you might think. Merely because it's not officially recognised doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And I think that we've got to be realistic about that. Of course, officially it doesn't happen because officially the relations would be between two people whose acts would be intrinsically disordered. But this is not taken seriously by any of the people involved. So if it's possible that the acts involved can build each other up in love and lead to the people sharing a life that is richer and more generous for others, then it is going to be blessed.
Perfection of principle.
And that's what's happening. I'm curiously, I'm actually quite keen on popes and bishops not getting involved in all that for the moment, because their tendency is always the legislative urge. Something is happening, let's make law about it. Now, it seems to me that we are only now coming to have a generation or generations, which are not yet fully available, where the possibility of being married to someone of the same sex has been part of the consciousness of a person since they became conscious. What age were you when same-sex marriage was passed?
Oh, it was 18 months ago, wasn't it?
No, not you, but...
I think it would have been just 18.
18, okay. But you weren't 8 or 9. I think that it's going to be really interesting when the kids who have never known a time when it wasn't possible, therefore when their emotional preparation, their dating structure, courtship and all that has become relatively normalised, I think that that's when we will start to have a proper sense of what same-sex marriage is going to be like, because we will have got people for whom it hasn't been part of a battle. And I think I'm all in favour of the battle, believe me, and I'm delighted to have been part of it. But the really interesting thing about something as basic as what is the shape of same-sex weddings comes when it's just kind of obvious. And the question is, therefore, it becomes more visible to people what we are blessing God for in asking down his blessings on this couple, so that they be able to bear a certain witness to Christian faith in their lives together. I think that starts to become possible when we have enough evidence. Enough people who can talk about this, like why I wanted to get married, why I've always wanted to get married. But this is not going to happen if people have been unable to dream of Prince Charming or whoever since the very first time they started to dream. Does that make sense?
Oh, no, it does. I mean, it's quite a debate here because, there is, as you know, there's a very strong strand in the gay community who resist completely that idea of falling into that pattern of which they regard as incredibly orthodox and constraining. And it's a sort of an anti, the notion that fidelity is defined like this. They really don't like it all. I mean, there's a particular man called Dennis Altman, who's a very good commentator here, who mounts a very good argument for finding that frightfully conservative and constraining. I don't, but he does.
Well, and I don't want to dictate the outcomes of what we find. I think that a marriage between two women is going to be different in certain ways from a marriage between two men. I think that there are real things to be discussed there. But I think that given time, the notion of marriage as being a battleground, as opposed to an ordinary part of flourishing and family life,
I see what you mean.
from which people then get to choose their battlegrounds,
Sure.
seems to me to be a question of, which is why I'm not in a huge hurry for the church to work out the issue of blessings or marriage. I am in a huge fuss for them to stop teaching that we are intrinsically disordered and objectively disordered, because that does direct harm to people. And it leads some people to seek conversion therapy, which leads some people to kill themselves. So there are all sorts of things that the church is not able to protect us against because it holds on
To those.
to those things. But it seems to me that step by step, let's change the definition first, then we can work out what flourishing looks like once we're no longer pretending that these people aren't something that they are.
Now, sorry, over here. Yeah.
Hello, my name's John. I'm from Little Bay. Thank you, Finn, and thank you, Geraldine, thank you, James. I've got two questions, which is probably a bit out of order, so I'll just see how we go with the first. And that is, I was really intrigued, James, by hearing your description of what I describe as Pope Francis's sort of self-insurgency in terms of trying to open things up without blowing the show up. I'm interested to hear a little bit more about that.
Is that part one, or you got a second one? Did you say you had two parts?
Yeah, the second one I'll mention, if you now. I've been involved in Catholic education for years and years, and I sit with leaders in Catholic education and other church organisations, and one of the things that strikes me is there's a lot of courage happening at all levels in Catholic institutions of people being prophetic. So, Finn, what happened at Riverview and your speech in 2018, there's a lot of things happening, with transgender kids and, across this city and other cities that happens with great care and love and the gospel, but happens very discreetly because, let's call it the Trump-delivered hate machine that comes across the world for after blood. So I suppose you're going to comment on that one too. So that's my two
Good
musings.
questions.
How interesting that you blame Trump rather than Murdoch.
Well, it's the same stuff,
Never mind. No, I agree. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. So the self-insurgency, my take it is that he recognises quite clearly that the clerical structure is not up to the task, and that the only way to do it is by having enough of a discussion that people become happy with it being changed, and that he, in a sense, is riding a wave that he has helped to create, and that he's aware that he can only put little digs into it. It'll be very interesting to see what happens over the next 4 weeks. Of course, we won't get to hear it. But it's worth remembering this, that at the first synod over which he presided, the Synod on the Family in 2014, a number of the people, his backroom boys, had provided a pretty interesting and quite LGBT-friendly series of, instrumentum laboris, whatever they call it, for the thing. But when it came time for the discussions, they didn't quite get the 2/3. It was like 62% and they needed 66%. So it was actually a large majority, but not quite big enough. But that hid something which we weren't aware of at the time, but then people who had been there in person have told me this under great confidence, which is that there was a massive row on the inside of the hall. And people who one might describe as the usual suspects went apeshit about the possibility of talking about this honestly. These are people for whom obviously it's difficult to tell whether there would be anything but the issue of homosexuality that could destroy the Catholic Church. From their point of view, it seemed to be up there as the most central feature of the Creed, despite mysteriously not appearing in the Creed for thousands of years. But I think that the Holy Father saw what, in one sense, ought to have been obvious from anybody who's watched how this has developed in other churches, which is that most of them have gone into schism over this issue, in one way or another, or are on the verge of it. This issue is irrationally allergic. Irrationally allergic for a whole variety of reasons. So my suspicion is that he realized from that point onwards that it was going to need a slow conversation to enable these discussions to happen. But I don't think it's only because he wants to sort out this issue. I think it's because he's aware that it's everything in the church, the position of women in the church. The moment you have women in a position of equality in a monosexual world, the women work out quickly who are gay and who is not. And it doesn't matter to them. So the whole of the fake man's club world starts to collapse, which is terrifying for some in the man's club since it's the only identity they've got. I think that that's the, if you like, the drama that is being played out. How to let the man's club collapse with all the areas that it has bad effects on, including, for instance, what I hope is obvious to us, with all the cover-up of child abuse issues and the first tendency of church person or church men in particular being cover up, hide, protect the reputation of the institution. And that's in large part because clerical formation makes us into liars. That's one of the conclusions which a sociologist he wrote a very, very good book. In Italian it's called La Casta dei Casti. He wrote a book about seminaries in northern Italy. And he had gone in imagining that he would find evidence that the church produced predators. And he said that to his amazement, that's not what he discovered. What he discovered, evidence, is that the church produces liars. Why? Because no honest discussion about matters of intimacy is possible. Because the only thing that could get you thrown out of the seminary system is being honest, whether you're straight or gay. So the straight minority or gay majority. The one thing that cannot be talked about is your intimacy. And that means that you gradually get used to a world of don't ask, don't tell, which is the systemic way that the man house has worked for centuries. And that means that it becomes incredibly difficult to distinguish between colleagues of yours who are being naughty, but in ways that are A, adult, and B, not criminal, and colleagues who are being both criminal and pathological. Because actually we prefer not to know. I'd rather you didn't tell me. You know how it works. And that's not good enough. But that's not because particular people are dishonest. It's because the system produces systemic dishonesty. And we now know that for the good of the church, that cannot be allowed to survive. And I'm quite sure that Francis, at least in part, realises that. Even if he's been slow, as someone have pointed out, not to deal with the abuse of minors, but to deal with abuse when it's between adults in the church. And there's an awful lot of that, both same-sex and other sex. But I take it that that's all on his agenda. If you excuse, I hope the answer wasn't too long.
Interesting answer. Yes.
I'm sorry, James. Michael Elphick. You've just answered the question. My question was, can we, in justice, hope to advance queer rights in the church without first dealing with what I think is the more significant issue, which is the lack of full rights for women in the church who don't enjoy a full baptism at the moment in the Catholic Church. So you've gone on and answered it, and my hunch was that both are denied because they threaten patriarchy. So I think you've answered my question, so thank you.
Yeah, I'm not even sure that patriarchy is a useful term, which is why I use words like men's club, because curiously I see much more patriarchy in Protestant cultures than I do in Catholic ones.
Hang on, that's fascinating. Go on.
Well, I mean, any of you who've ever visited Northern Ireland, the family structure entirely different according to. Remember that the model of the pastor is very much the Old Testament model, and women are very submissive. And women not being allowed to speak and so on and so forth is much stronger, whereas Catholic Ireland is much more matriarchal.
Thank you very much for your perspective, James. I feel that we slightly haven't answered the question of tonight's topic, which is, what does radical inclusivity really mean for a modern synodal church? And the reason I don't think we've answered that question is that whilst you have offered a really extensive discussion about the institutional nature of it, there's been no discussion of us in the parishes. There has been a limited discussion about schooling, which would be good to hear more about, because it would be really good to know if the experiences you had at school were actually religiously discriminatory or just discriminatory, because there are two different experiences that gay students have in schools. So I'd love Finn to talk about that. But I think my frustration is that we're in parishes, we're not in Rome. We're in parishes. What does radical inclusivity mean for us in parishes? And does it even need to be radical? Could it just be inclusive? Finn, would you like to give that a go?
Sure. Good question. I'll focus more on the educational side of it. I think I can provide a bit more personalised insight, I guess, hopefully. In terms of the discrimination aspect of your question, I experienced both religious discrimination from teachers, predominantly, in my earlier years of high school, mainly through religious education classes, where teachers being very blatant, saying homosexuality is a sin, you're not to practice it, and that was how I was taught. Then, obviously, as I've mentioned, there was also social discrimination and discrimination through violence and from students. And I think in terms of a school perspective of supporting students and children and young people, that's ultimately going to be the main priority. And I think that should transition quite easily to a parish, where a school is a community, a parish is a community of people, and you want to be able to welcome those people so that they can be themselves, that they can support each other, and like I said earlier, they can be themselves, because it's only in being yourself that you can be supported and loved by others. And I think that ultimately when it comes down to that, and that support and that love and having those support structures in place, that I do believe that we can become a stronger community and we can become a lot more supportive of ourselves. In terms of more radical steps that I've personally experienced schools taking from a religious standpoint as well, I remember being told just before I did the speech that the principal at the time had called, I don't even know the proper term or the name, but whoever's the Jesuit authority for Sydney or for New South Wales, to essentially say this is what we're doing and not asking permission, but this is what we're doing. And you can support that, you don't have to, but we're supporting our students. And after my speech, I had one of the priests come up and hug me and tell me that I was loved and I was supported by the school and I was supported by God as well. And that's probably more of a radical outlook, and it was a big step, and it was on a community and I guess a parish, because Review is a parish, front where that radical step was taken and that individual step was taken, and it made a huge difference. And I think it made that ongoing difference because of the amount of support that came from parents, from students, from teachers as well. And since then, one of the greatest men that I know and frequently chat to, a religious education teacher at Review, Paul Ackmar, and Mr. Reamer as well, another teacher at Review, both educate me and continue to tell me about faith and religion and include homosexuality in that. And I know that they're the future of teaching that at Review. And that's what makes me realise that that's something that's going to continue in the future.
Terrific to hear. Does that satisfy you?
Hopefully that satisfies you on that perspective, but I'm sure James could probably a bit more parish perspective.
Yeah.
No. But I would ask you rather, what was your experience of discussion of these matters in the build-up to the synodal process? Because I imagine that your parishes were all invited to, or did that not happen in Sydney?
Yeah, well, we had with our plenary council too. We had this really, which was like a dress rehearsal.
Dress rehearsal.
Very much so.
So, did the discussions happen, as it were, in a non-radically radical way, in your experience?
It is easy within a largely Jesuit perspective to be able to discuss these things. Incredibly grateful that I am for the centuries of Jesuit perspective that they offer, and amazed to have a Jesuit Pope at all. I suppose I'm always a little wary of words like radical inclusivity, because as a gay person for 40 years, I'm not necessarily needing radical inclusivity. I'm just needing inclusivity. I'm just needing it not to be a problem. I'm just needing it to be something we don't have to think about. And, Geraldine, you said Jesus didn't say anything about it. Well, that was great. In a way, it would be really great if we didn't have to keep speaking about it.
But he did say a lot about women who were similar, who were completely left out of the structures, and he put a lot of effort into naming the need for women, and we all know those stories. But he didn't. It's just as intrigued me, because he saw the need and answered it in one group, but he didn't in another.
Yes, I suspect there's significant theological and socio-demographic reasons for why that could have been the case, and I don't disagree. We need to have that discussion too. I suppose I just wonder, Finn speaks very powerfully about that moment of just that little social acceptance, those tiny little gestures. I believe the greatest things that will ever happen is when, the heterosexual PE coach puts down any kind of gay discriminatory discussion. Because in a way, that should be what it should be for anybody. It shouldn't be up to anybody to particularly radicalize the discussion. It is in our acts of fellowship that we show our devotion to Christianity. It is in our ways and our thought processes that we show that. And I suppose
my concern is that whilst there's so much discussion about the institutionalised things going on in Rome and the popes and the structures and all of that sort of stuff, that those of us in the parishes are left in a vacuum as to know what to do.
Look, I'll hand it over. The only thing I'd say, and from the plenary council, is that there was a sense there was so much to be discussed, about theological formation, about the admission of women, about the sense of belonging, etc., etc. I mean, it was an extraordinary experience, that plenary council. That really, it was definitely there, but it was only one, which wouldn't satisfy you. But I mean, that was very much the sense that I got when it was part of the discussion. Yes, please.
John Carpenter. I'd like to focus on a principle that you elaborated and broaden the discussion a little bit. While you were talking, I was very conscious of the fact that you were standing in front of a very Australian photograph. I'd like to bring the discussion down to Australia. There's 3 marvellous proteas there, 4 marvellous proteas. At this very moment, we're going through the so-called debate about a referendum on the inclusion of Indigenous people into the Constitution. So what you're talking about in terms of talkability has a much broader context. Nothing is real unless we talk about it, because if we don't talk about it, we don't think it's important. So I'd like you to just commend you for the breadth of principle that you've elaborated by talking about things.
Thank you, Joe. Yes, and then we'll take one more, and Francois, is it? And then we'll come back.
Francois Kunz. Thank you to both of you. James, I don't think we'll need to wait for the kids who were born when same-sex marriage was permissible for the culture to move. I have the privilege of working with people of Finn's age and a bit older who are tertiary educated, rising young professionals. And I have to say, for them, who you sleep with is completely irrelevant in terms of how they measure the value of a human being and measure the value of a relationship. So the church is actually talking right past them if the church asserts the positions that we've been talking about. So my question really is this. Turn it around. How do we address these young people who are, in a sense, the future of the church, but perhaps the absent future of the church? So my question to Finn, as a young layperson, is there anything you find attractive in the proclamation of the Catholic Church once you look past this issue of how we treat LGBTIQA plus people? And Father James, if I came to you as a non-Catholic and recognising everything we've been talking about and said, why should I become a Catholic? What would you answer?
I guess for me personally, and I think as it was said by you before, one of the most beautiful and attractive things about religion and about Catholicism is the ethics and the teachings behind it, and the amazing work that is behind a lot of these religious acts. The kindness, the support of homeless people, the support of education. There's so many beautiful things that come of religion. And I think that it's really important that, once you, like you said, once you can look past and hopefully one day work past a lot of the discrimination that is happening in the church, it's when those acts that people make in the name of religion, we'll be able to shine, and I'm hoping that's what's going to bring the next generation of people to the church, is to be able to continue those acts and continue supporting those marginalised communities or whatever situation it might be.
So the kindness, you say, exactly, is a calling card, even if it's boundaried, by the sound of you, by diffidence.
Yes, I think, I mean, like the discussion's been saying tonight, I think the steps are being made to remove those limitations. But I think ultimately it's the kindness that brings people people in nowadays to the church. There's no need for religion to be involved in marriage. People can live very happy lives without religion involved, and people realise that now. It's the acts of kindness that people choose to make with religion being an additional factor to that I think is the future for the church. And I think that's what people are realising now, is that there's so much good through the ethical teachings of churches, and that's the kind of things that we've got to keep hold of.
In fact, the space of your tent document, instead of behaving like gatekeepers, the document says, we need to make sure that people know that everyone can find a place and a home there. I mean, that's exactly what you're saying, yet to be lived out. Now, how would you respond to that? Very good question.
Yeah, the way I respond to it, as someone who, I became a Catholic when I was 18 and very obviously have failed to be part of it properly ever since. And I'm a non-person in officialese. But why I love it is because I understand that it's a very non-churchy church. That the key thing about being Catholic is about the spreading of Jesus' message universally, which means learning to discover who we are, how we are formed by each other, learning to love each other without boundaries. And this is something which happens largely without and beyond the reach of any of our authorities. We are, if you excuse the language, many Indians and very few chiefs. And most other churches are many chiefs and relatively few Indians. And that seems to be an enormous advantage. That being Catholic is part of being on the adventure of humanity, discovering what it might be possible to be like as reconciled humans. And that's what Jesus was about. And that it's a wonderfully unchurchy place to be that, because so much of the church stuff is nonsense. One has to see through it and keep on trying to find one's way back to the core thing which Jesus did and the Holy Spirit brings out and pushes us. That's how I would live that. And I should say that I get quite frequent, offers from kind people from other churches who want to say, but it would be so much better if you become a minister in our church. It'll be fine. I said, no, it's much better to be a living fish in the ocean than a big fish in an aquarium. This is the ocean. It's a mess. There are all sorts of sharks in it as well. But it's the real thing. That's for me is the...
Well, look, I don't think I'll add at all. I think that's a beautiful summation. Really has been quite a night. Thank you both very much indeed, and I think it's immensely thought-provoking and not simple. Not simple by either of you. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to invite Richard McLaughlin, I think, is coming up to thank our speakers, but thank you for being here tonight and for all of those wonderful questions. Would you care to thank our guests, please?
Thank you, Geraldine. For a very brief 29 years, Catalyst for Renewal has been supporting and involved in conversation. That's our focus. We talk about the spirituality of conversation, and that through conversation we can change and grow close to God and be more authentically who we are meant to be. We don't believe in forbidden conversations, only respectful ones. Conversation, talkability, imagining. Tonight we've been led in conversation on the broader concepts and backgrounds of our very ability to have this conversation. To Finn sharing a very real and personal journey. Finn used the word struggle and talked of some appalling behaviours towards him, which is and was not loving, not Christian. But he also gave witness to some amazing and supportive moments where he has been accompanied on his journey, and that has helped him to flourish. In 2018, at a Catalyst dinner, the Jesuit astronomer guy, I can never say his surname, Consul Magno, talked about a conversation of curious people because they are hungry in their souls for the meaning of it all. I think tonight we did indeed further this conversation about the meaning. What does it mean to be Christian? We've talked, perhaps because of conversations like this and many others, the slow and steady shift in our church's position. Perhaps prompted by Guy from the floor's question, I'm reminded of a comment by Francis Sullivan that so often we behave as adults outside the church and children within it. We need to speak up and reach out. Diversity is not a negative. Inclusion of diversity is not a negative. Lord Jonathan Sacks said in conversation in Sydney that God loves diversity. Look at nature, look at creation, look at our world, look at us. God loves us. And acknowledging and accepting this diversity, we can look at and discover and accept and love all appropriate forms of flourishing. We hope to have a video record of this event on our website quite soon, and we draw our attention to our website and Instagram for future events. For those who don't regularly attend Catalyst events, we especially thank you for coming and hope you will come again and join us in our efforts to further conversation. We thank the many people at CRA and Catalyst who helped to make this event possible. Thanks to the Jesuit community and staff at St Aloysius for hosting us. Thanks to our photographer and videographer, to Geraldine, of course, a long-standing Catalyst member. And especially thanks to James and Finn for leading us in the conversation and sharing their journey. I ask you to join me and show our thanks.
Father Christmas has arrived. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.